Hello, scholars. It's great to be with you again. During the last 2 weeks, we've covered a lot of information in your reading and videos. I think by now you figured out this is not a course on differentiated instruction. You knew that when we started, but I hope that as we've progressed, you've begun to see that we've gone way beyond differentiation to explore why differentiation becomes difficult when we turn our attention toward those who may be most misunderstood and vulnerable among us. I don't know any Christian who would deny that children with exceptionalities should be seen through the eyes of Christian love. But despite this observation, the consensus clearly indicates that Christian schools lag far behind our secular colleagues in providing a place for exceptional children to belong. How can we claim to believe that all are made in God's image and likeness and not do at least as much as those who do not claim a faith as a motivator for their work and may even disavow such a faith? For the last 30 years, theological scholars have been writing about these problems. Authors like Eastland, Reynolds, and Young have not only written about the stigma and exclusion they've experienced, but these are theological scholars who've also written in-depth theological analyses which help clarify our understanding of Scripture. Moreover, educational scholarship on teaching methods and differentiation for exceptional children has always been equally available to public and private sector education professionals. While I do not imply there's a sinister motive at hand, I likewise do not accept the assertion that we, Christian educators, do not reach exceptional children because we are unaware of the need or because we don't know how. The preponderance of evidence offered by the sheer volumes of literature seem to easily refute such claims. So why does it seem that we do consistently less than our secular colleagues in this area? Is it because of money, resources, because Christian schools must bill families directly? These probably all contribute to the problem, but in addition to observing our limitations, I invite you to observe that we serve the same God who delivered the children of Israel from Egyptian bondage, and that God partnered with a mere mortal man who felt inadequate to the task God was calling him to. God's answer to Moses' fears is, "I will be with you," in Exodus 3:12. We serve the same God who turned a vicious persecutor of the early church into the world's most famous missionary and the author of more than a quarter of the New Testament. We serve the same God who called fearful Gideon a mighty man of valor in Judges 6:12. Meanwhile, Gideon saw himself as the weakest in his family, which he said was the weakest in his clan from the weakest tribe of Israel. God's only answer to Gideon appears in verse 16, "But I will be with you." Let's contrast that with another lesson from the biblical text about one who was least among the multitudes. The feeding of the 5,000 is a story told in Matthew, Luke, and John. John's gospel tends to offer details not found in other accounts, and this story is no different. John indicates that when Jesus instructed his apostles to feed the multitude, they objected, focused only on what they did not have and how much money it would take to buy the food needed to obey Jesus' command. Meanwhile, the text in John 6 indicates that Andrew, Peter's brother, found a boy who was offering to share his humble portion. What the boy had, that is, what he brought, was not enough. But the Lord was with him. We know how the story ends. Everyone was filled, and there was plenty left over. Considering these teachings, I think we should be careful how we evaluate our capabilities. I think we may often check our financial balance sheets, and because of that information, we never check with God about what He would have us do. While we should always begin God's work in prayer, God also offers us much in the way of scholarly wisdom, which He builds within us over time. Let's look back quickly over the last couple of weeks. We viewed some videos of students who might be thought by some to lack genuine consciousness, and some others who were thought to be troublemakers. Yet, when seen with a properly enlightened view of humanity, these children, all of them, were treated with love and as though they were capable, and they thrived, all of them. Some were artists, some were teachers, some in math and science, but all grew into their giftedness, whatever it was. Here we see the value of community, even in a secular context. How much more important should this be to us, the church, as we help children thrive to realize their giftedness for the edification of the church and the glory of God? While it's easy to see how these stories may invite us to consider the importance of patience and adapting our methods for people with easily seen differences, I would argue that these people have merely helped illustrate what believers ought to be doing for everyone. Later, we talked about social distance and contact theory. Social distance, as you remember, is the perception of differences between oneself and others as perceived by either party. Consequently, because of our perceptions of difference and our attraction to sameness, we tend to naturally prefer the company of people we consider to be much like ourselves. One point that we didn't really dwell on was the fact that this instinctive desire to maintain social distances did not have to be, and often are not, motivated by feelings of intolerance or hatred. Unfortunately, some mistake innocent-sounding motives as a redefining of the problem. I don't believe a Christian school would ever tell a disabled child that they were not welcome because of a disability. But that does not change the fact that disability is indeed the reason that child cannot belong, and that, when viewed in light of Scripture, is a problem. Speaking of social distance as a theological topic, we now observe through research by Marcy Williams Webb that some Christian communities do indeed promote the importance of accepting and assisting those with exceptionalities into the full life and fellowship of the church. Reynolds 2012 affirms, as does Baker 2015, there are many churches who view the human worth and dignity of people with disabilities as it ought to be seen. But these perspectives are not widely published. How do we explain apparent conflicts between the accepting attitudes we report to have about all people, while our measured behavior outcomes are antithetical? As we've discussed in the past, Willette Kuntz and colleagues point to social acceptability bias. Theorists and practitioners have long been concerned that sensitivity to social acceptability may explain some of these conflicted findings. Wilson and Seor point to research which has shown that spoken, explicit attitudes and our behavioral, implicit attitudes are actually processed differently in our brains. And although they are interconnected, which attitude prevails at any one time depends largely on the situation at hand. If I were to ask you, what do you think about kids with disabilities? You would give me the answer you've been taught to believe is true and correct. You're likely to say something like, children with disabilities are fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image, just like the rest of us. Does everyone you work with at your school or church believe that? Yes, you'd reply. Wilson and Seor explain that implicit and explicit attitudes are intellectually sourced, recalled, and expressed differently. Depending on the type of encounter one has with the attitude object, that is, the person or thing eliciting a response, the social context in which those encounters occur, different kinds of attitudes come into play. Accordingly, our responses to the same question may vary. This means that if we expect to effect change, we have to address the right kind of attitudes. As educators, we usually instinctively address attitudes through education, in our traditional Western sense of the word. We tell, we lecture, we do exercises, and test for knowledge. Last week, we reviewed the importance of contact as a means of offering opportunities for non-threatening contact with people who are very different from self. This is how we inform our implicit attitudes. Let's talk a little more about what each kind of attitude is and how it's formed. Explicit attitudes are formulated and communicated consciously. They require forethought and consideration. Such thought and consideration allow attitudes to be recalled, expressed, and, if necessary, restrained or edited or otherwise amended as a matter of one's will. As explicit attitudes are developed, and as those attitudes mature, They require more cognitive demand and more time to express than implicit attitudes. Finally, explicit attitudes are likely to be the ones that are most sensitive to the influences of social acceptability bias that we discussed last week. Explicit attitudes become more developed and more complex with time, and they may change as one has the time, motivation, information, life experience, and cognitive ability to reshape them. According to the value account model developed by Betsch, Plessner, and Schallies, explicit attitudes are not directly related to the brain's affective processing center, so they are not typically influenced by emotional stimuli. Explicit attitudes grow from the brain's reflective processing system and depend more heavily on the knowledge and the individual's ability to evaluate the average quality of the sum of all experience and information on a particular subject, like working closely with people who have disabilities. Implicit attitudes, on the other hand, are those which are automatically activated from the brain's impulsive processing systems. They are recalled without effort or intention and are closely related to affective, that is, emotional responses. Accordingly, implicit attitudes can influence behavior with little requirement for conscious thought or cognitive demand. They occur spontaneously, requiring no time to consider and plan a response. So, implicit attitudes are not consciously controlled by the individual. Instead, they surface suddenly upon encountering value-charged information or an attitude object. This may explain why one might seem hasty to resist a conversation on plans to begin including exceptional learners at a school which currently has none. You may not be seeing prejudice at work or even a lack of faith. You may be seeing the quick, uncontrolled surfacing of implicit attitudes, which grew due to the absence of meaningful, non-threatening contact with a person who has disabilities. This lack of contact deprives individuals of the kind of personal experience needed to form positive implicit attitudes of their own. Research believes that when positive self-reported attitudes, such as those claiming to believe that all people are equal in the sight of God, conflict with observed social distancing behaviors, which are seen in many churches and Christian schools, it is likely that the prevailing attitudes guiding policy are explicit, while attitudes guiding behavior are implicit. This presents problems for those who wish to introduce new capabilities to reach exceptional students, where many legitimate concerns may present themselves. How do we ensure the safety for these children? How will we know if they're not well, if they can't speak? These are fair questions which elicit emotional responses from the genuinely caring side of us, which seeks to protect these children. But, unfortunately, when we fear, we are far more likely to avoid these children than take an active role in their education and spiritual edification. It's important to note, once again, that meaningful, non-threatening contact is helpful here. Even though explicit and implicit attitudinal constructs exist and function separately, the mental processes which drive them are not entirely divided. They function in parallel and, at times, interdependently. As one educates themselves, for instance, they fortify their capacity to form an explicit attitude about something with which they have no experience. They can actually learn enough that they're willing to consider trying something new. For instance, they might be willing to have contact with a person who challenges their comfort zone. This contact may then give them the needed experience to transform future emotional responses. The formation of newly transformed implicit attitudes can further enlighten a subject on the kind of information they need to form even more helpful attitudes in the future. A good example of this is studying something in school without practical experience, which is a form of contact. Once you had practical experience, contact, in a student teaching, how many of you thought, my goodness, if I had done my practical experience earlier, I would have understood some of my classroom material much better. This illustrates very clearly the role of implicit and explicit thought and how they help each other. Subjects contextualize their social encounters, and these contextualizations drive the subject's employment and use of attitudes and behavior. This is true for kids when you're trying to include an exceptional child in the school, but it's also true for adults, teachers, administrators, and probably most importantly, the parents of your typically developing students. As experiences are added, another new sum of experiences results and creates a new and ever-evolving summative contextual evaluation about the presence of exceptional learners. Over time, you can view the changes in attitude. This evolving picture of attitudes further influences future potential growth and modifies how all future encounters with exceptional children may be seen. How one socially contextualizes an encounter with an exceptional child can be influenced by many factors. Among them is the amount of time the subject perceives is available to form and employ a response. Another may be the cognitive demand required versus the subject's available cognitive capacity or their willingness to devote cognitive effort for a particular kind of encounter. For clarification, cognitive demand is defined in the present context as the kind and level of thinking required to successfully engage a task or solve a problem. The task in this case is to get to know a child with exceptionalities in a particular kind of social environment, such as a Christian school. The subject's level of motivation, their experience and ability to respond positively guides how this engagement will go. If a subject feels unprepared and rushed into an encounter, they are likely to respond with an implicit attitude which motivates a self-protective emotional response. Conversely, when you prepare people with small doses of non-threatening contact with exceptional learners with whom your subjects can form relationships with over time, their implicit and explicit attitudes have a chance to grow together. Then, when not feeling rushed and able to devote prayer and thought to such a decision, you will find that more people, more students, teachers, and parents will be supportive of goals to include different kinds of learners. There is really so much more we could say about this, but we'll have to end it here. I hope you found this enlightening and useful to your goals in teaching and expanding the reach of your school to help the exceptional learners you already have. Maybe this inspired the beginnings of what may become a plan to propose that your school begin serving these children of our Most High and Merciful God. They too can be included in the Great Commission and sent into our Father's harvest fields with their own gifts and talents well developed. I'll see you next time, and remember, I'm on your side.